For 26 years, my parents told me I was a disappointment, a burden, someone who would never amount to anything. They made me believe I was genetically destined for failure, that mediocrity ran in my blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But when I took a simple DNA test to trace my ancestry, I discovered something that shattered their lives forever. I wasn't just worth something. I was worth $47 million, and my parents had known the truth all along. My name is Luna, and this is the story of how a $99 saliva test exposed the biggest deception of my life and revealed why my parents spent decades convincing me I was worthless. The rain was hammering against the windows of my cramped studio apartment in southeast Portland when the email arrived. I'd been sitting on my second-hand couch, eating instant ramen for the third night in a row, scrolling through job postings that all seemed to require qualifications I didn't have. The notification chimed on my phone and I almost ignored it. Heritage Genetics Lab. The subject line read, "Your DNA results are ready." I'd submitted the test kit 3 months earlier during a moment of curiosity. My friend Carmen had gotten hers done and discovered fascinating connections to relatives across Europe. She'd encouraged me to try it, mostly because I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family. While my younger brother Ethan had my father's dark hair and my mother's green eyes, I was blonde with blue eyes that nobody could explain. When I asked about it as a child, my mother Victoria would wave her hand dismissively and say genetics were unpredictable, that I probably inherited some recessive traits from distant relatives. The Heritage Genetics website loaded slowly on my ancient laptop. I entered my confirmation number with shaking fingers, though I couldn't explain why my hands were trembling. Maybe it was the cold seeping through the thin walls of my apartment. Or maybe some part of me sensed that everything was about to change. The ancestry breakdown appeared first. Irish, German, Scottish, all fairly typical for someone from the Pacific Northwest. But then I scrolled down to the section labeled Close DNA Matches, and my world tilted sideways. At the top of the list was a name I didn't recognize. William Harrison III. Relationship. Father. Confidence. 99. 9%. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. William Harrison III wasn't my father. Marcus was my father. Marcus, who worked at the Riverside Import Company downtown, who came home every evening smelling like coffee and disappointment, who had spent my entire childhood telling me I'd inherited his family's tendency toward failure. Marcus, who shared my mother's favorite hobby of listing my shortcomings over dinner. My laptop battery was dying, but I couldn't stop refreshing the page, hoping the results would change. They didn't. William Harrison III remained at the top of my match list, along with several other Harrisons I'd never heard of. There was a phone number listed under his profile, and after staring at it for 20 minutes, I screenshot the entire page. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed replaying every conversation, every moment when my parents had made me feel inadequate. The time Victoria told me not to bother applying to college because money would be wasted on someone with my limited potential. The countless occasions when Marcus compared me unfavorably to Ethan, who was apparently destined for greatness with his inherited business acumen. The way they both spoke about genetics like it was a prison sentence, as if my DNA contained nothing but disappointment and mediocrity. But if Marcus wasn't my biological father, then everything they'd said about my genetic destiny was built on a lie. The next morning, I called in sick to my job at the coffee shop where I'd been working since dropping out of community college 2 years earlier. I'd tried to explain to my parents that I wanted to study art therapy, but Victoria had laughed and said I was being unrealistic. "People like us don't go into fields like that," she'd said. "We work practical jobs and keep our heads down." I'd believed her then, just like I'd believed everything else they'd told me about my limitations. I spent the morning researching William Harrison III online. What I found made my hands shake again, but for entirely different reasons. He wasn't just wealthy, he was extraordinarily wealthy. The founder of Harrison Maritime Solutions, a company that had revolutionized shipping logistics on the West Coast. According to the most recent Forbes article I could find, his net worth was estimated at over $200 million. The article included a photograph of him at some charity gala in San Francisco. He was probably in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably familiar. When I covered the bottom half of his face with my hand, I was looking at my own eyes staring back at me. The same shade of blue, the same slight crinkle at the corners when he smiled. But the most shocking discovery came when I found his obituary. William Harrison III had died 8 months ago from a sudden heart attack. He was survived by his wife of 30 years, Margaret, and their son, William Harrison IV. No mention of any daughters. No mention of me. I called the number listed on the DNA website with my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the ringtone. A woman answered on the third ring. "Harrison residence, this is Margaret speaking." Her voice was warm and cultured, nothing like my mother's sharp Portland accent. I realized I had no idea what to say. How do you tell someone that you might be their late husband's daughter? "Hi, this is Luna. I'm calling because I received some DNA results that suggest William Harrison III might have been my biological father." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh my God. Luna. We've been looking for you for 27 years. The words hit me like a physical blow. They'd been looking for me, which meant they'd known I existed, which meant someone had been keeping us apart. Margaret's voice became stronger, more urgent. "Where are you? Are you safe? William never stopped searching for you. He hired investigators. He put notices in newspapers. He even started a foundation hoping you might see it and contact us. He died believing he'd failed you." I was crying now, ugly sobs that made it difficult to speak. "I'm in Portland. I've been in Portland my whole life. My parents never told me anything about him." "Your mother," Margaret said, and there was something sharp in her tone now. "Victoria, correct?" She took money from William to disappear, a substantial amount. She promised she'd stay away and never contact us again. The room felt like it was spinning. "What money?" "She was pregnant with you when she approached William. She said she needed financial help and that she'd leave town if he provided it. He gave her $500,000, thinking it was the right thing to do. He had no idea she'd stayed in Portland all these years, raising you so close to us." $500,000. My parents had taken $500,000 to hide me from my biological father, and they'd spent my entire childhood making me believe I was worthless while sitting on a fortune they'd earned by selling my identity. Margaret continued talking, her words coming faster now. "William left everything to you in his will. Everything. The house, the company shares, the investments. We've been trying to find you to execute the will, but we only had your first name and your approximate age. The lawyer said it might take years." "How much?" I whispered. $47 million, sweetheart. Your father left you $47 million. I hung up the phone and immediately threw up in my kitchen sink. $47 million. I was worth $47 million, and my parents had convinced me I wasn't worth the price of a college education. They'd taken money to hide me from a father who'd spent decades searching for me, a father who'd died never knowing whether I was alive or safe. The fury came slowly, building like a tide. I thought about every time Victoria had told me I was setting my sights too high. Every occasion when Marcus had shaken his head sadly and said, I just didn't have what it takes. Every family dinner where they'd praised Ethan's achievements while barely acknowledging my presence. They hadn't been protecting me from disappointment. They'd been protecting themselves from discovery. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the box where I kept important documents. My birth certificate was there, with Marcus listed as my father. Another lie, beautifully printed on official paper. But tucked behind it was something I'd never paid much attention to. A letter from a law firm in San Francisco, addressed to, my parents and dated from when I was 6 years old. I'd found it years ago when helping my mother organize some papers, and she'd snatched it away quickly, saying it was just boring legal stuff about insurance. Now I read it carefully. The letterhead belonged to Harrison, Burke and Associates. The letter was brief and formal, requesting confirmation of my current address and well-being for their client, William Harrison III. They offered a substantial finder's fee for any information leading to my location. My parents had received this letter 20 years ago. They'd known someone was looking for me and they'd hidden it. How many other letters had there been? How many attempts to reach me had they intercepted? I needed to see Victoria and Marcus. I needed to look them in the eye and demand answers. But first, I called Margaret back. "I want to see his will," I said when she answered. "I want to see everything." "Of course. Can you come to San Francisco? I'll have our lawyers meet with you. Luna, there's so much your father wanted you to know. He left letters, photographs. He even bought you gifts every year on your birthday. He never gave up hope." I was crying again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from grief for the father I'd never known, the father who'd thought about me every year while I grew, up believing I was unwanted. "I'll be there tomorrow," I said. "But first, I need to have a conversation with the people who raised me." That evening, I drove to my parents' house in Lake Oswego for the first time in 3 months. They lived in a modest ranch-style home, nothing fancy, but certainly comfortable. Comfortable enough to make me wonder what they'd done with the $500,000 they'd taken from William Harrison. Ethan's car was in the driveway, a new Honda Civic that my parents had helped him buy for his senior year of college. I'd asked for help with community college tuition 2 years ago and been told that money was tight, that I needed to be more realistic about my expectations. Victoria answered the door wearing her usual expression of mild disappointment, as if my very presence was an inconvenience. "Luna, you should have called first. We need to talk. All of us." Marcus appeared behind her, already reaching for his coat. "Actually, we were just heading out to dinner. Maybe another time." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "No." My voice was steadier than I felt. "We're going to talk now, or I'm going to start asking questions you won't want me to ask." Something in my tone made them both pause. Victoria stepped aside reluctantly, and I followed them into the living room where Ethan was watching television. "Turn that off," I said to my brother. "You're going to want to hear this." Marcus sat down heavily in his recliner, the same chair where he'd delivered countless lectures about my shortcomings over the years. Victoria remained standing, arms crossed, defensive. "I took a DNA test," I announced. The reaction was immediate and telling. Marcus went pale. Victoria's eyes widened with something that looked like panic. Only Ethan seemed confused. "And?" Victoria said, trying to sound casual. "And Marcus isn't my father." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan looked between our parents with growing confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means," I continued, my voice getting stronger, "that everything you've told me about genetics and family traits and inherited limitations has been a lie. It means my real father was someone else entirely." Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Luna, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but William Harrison III. I said the name like a weapon. "Ring any bells?" Victoria actually stumbled backward, catching herself on the arm of the couch. Marcus looked like he might be having a heart attack. "Who's William Harrison?" Ethan asked. "Their daughter's biological father," I said, never taking my eyes off Victoria. "The man who's been looking for me for 27 years. The man who died 8 months ago believing he'd failed me." The man who left me $47 million in his will. Ethan's mouth fell open. 47 million. How much did he pay you? I asked Victoria directly. How much money did you take to hide me from him? Victoria's composure finally cracked. It wasn't like that, she said, but her voice was shaking. He didn't want you. He offered us money to go away and never contact him again. That's a lie. I pulled out my phone and played a voicemail Margaret had left while I was driving over. Her warm voice filled the room. Luna, darling, I wanted you to know that your father never stopped talking about you. Every Christmas, every birthday, he'd wonder what you were doing, whether you were happy. He bought you presents every year and kept them in your room. Yes, you have a room here. You've always had a room here. I stopped the playback. He didn't pay you to disappear. He paid you because you told him you needed help, and then you disappeared anyway. You took his money and kept me from him. Marcus finally found his voice. We did what we thought was best. You were our daughter. We raised you. We loved you. You convinced me I was worthless. The words exploded out of me. You spent 26 years telling me I wasn't smart enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't good enough for anything better than what I had. You made me believe I was genetically programmed to fail. We were trying to protect you from disappointment, Victoria said weakly. No, I said. You were protecting yourselves from discovery. You were afraid he'd find me and you'd have to give the money back. Ethan was staring at our parents like he'd never seen them before. Is this true? Did you really take money to keep Luna away from her real father? Neither of them answered, but their silence was answer enough. I stood up, my legs surprisingly steady. I'm going to San Francisco tomorrow to meet with his lawyers. I'm going to learn about the father you stole from me. And then I'm going to decide what to do about the fact that you committed fraud, extortion, and probably several other crimes I haven't thought of yet. Victoria reached toward me, but I stepped back. Luna, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, I said. I understand that you convinced a grieving man that I was better off without him, while you raised me to believe I was better off with nothing. I walked toward the door, then turned back one more time. By the way, what did you do with the $500,000? Because it certainly didn't go toward my education or my future. Ethan's college fund, maybe? His new car? The guilt on their faces told me everything I needed to know. As I drove home through the Portland drizzle, I thought about William Harrison III, the father I'd never met but who'd never stopped loving me. Tomorrow, I would learn about the life he'd wanted to share with me. But tonight, I grieved for all the years we'd lost, and I planned what I was going to do with the truth that would change everything. The flight to San Francisco felt surreal. I'd never been on a plane before, another experience my parents had deemed unnecessary for someone with my prospects. As the aircraft climbed above the Oregon mountains, I pressed my face against the window and wondered if William Harrison had ever flown this same route, searching for me. Margaret had arranged for a car to pick me up at the airport. The driver, a kind elderly man named Robert, told me he'd worked for the Harrison family for 15 years. His eyes grew misty when he talked about William. Mr. Harrison was a good man, he said as we drove through the city. Never met anyone who cared more about family. He used to say that the most important thing in life wasn't what you accomplished, but who you loved and who loved you back. The Harrison house sat on a hill overlooking the bay, its white columns and wraparound porch somehow both grand and welcoming. Margaret met me at the front door, and I understood immediately why William had loved her. She had the kind of warmth that made you feel safe just standing near her. You look exactly like him, she said, touching my cheek gently. The same eyes, the same stubborn chin. He would have been so proud to see the woman you've become. She led me through rooms filled with antiques and family photographs, but stopped at a door on the second floor. This was yours, she said softly, turning the handle. The room took my breath away. It wasn't a guest room or a storage space. It was clearly a daughter's bedroom, decorated with care and attention to detail. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and shelves lined the room, filled with books, art supplies, and wrapped presents with gift tags that read, "For Luna," in careful handwriting. Margaret noticed me staring at the presents. Every birthday, every Christmas. He never stopped hoping you'd come home to open them. I picked up one of the packages, dated from my 16th birthday. Inside was a set of professional art supplies and a note. For my daughter, who I hope is discovering her talents and following her dreams. Love always, Dad. The tears came without warning. While I'd been working minimum wage jobs and believing I had no artistic ability, my real father had been buying me art supplies and believing in dreams I'd never been allowed to have. Margaret sat beside me on the bed that had been waiting for me for 26 years. He talked about you constantly, wondered what you looked like, what you enjoyed doing, whether you were happy. He started the Harrison Foundation partly because he hoped you might see it and recognize his name. The Harrison Foundation? Arts education for underprivileged children. He believed every child deserved the chance to explore their creativity, regardless of their circumstances. He said he'd failed his own daughter by letting her slip away, but maybe he could help other children find their potential. I thought about all the times I'd shown interest in art, only to have Victoria dismiss it as impractical. How different would my life have been if I'd grown up knowing I had a father who believed in nurturing creativity? Margaret showed me photo albums filled with pictures of William at various stages of his life. Business meetings, charity events, quiet moments at home. In many of the photos, he looked thoughtful, almost sad, as if part of him was always missing. He kept investigators on retainer for years, Margaret explained. They'd follow up on any lead, no matter how small. When you turned 18, he hoped you might start looking for him on your own. He never imagined Victoria had told you he was dead. Dead? I looked up sharply. She never told me my father was dead. She just never mentioned him at all. When I asked, she'd say Marcus was my father and change the subject. Margaret's expression darkened. The investigators found her when you were about 10. They approached her directly, offering a substantial reward for information about your whereabouts. She told them William had died in a car accident and that you'd been adopted by a family who'd moved to another state. She even showed them a fake death certificate. The magnitude of Victoria's deception was staggering. She hadn't just hidden me from William. She'd actively deceived his investigators, sending them on false trails while keeping me close enough to monitor. Why would she do that? Why keep me if she didn't want me? Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I think she enjoyed the power. Having you nearby meant she could control the situation completely. If you'd been adopted far away, there was always a chance William might find you through official channels. But keeping you close, under a different name, with false documents, it guaranteed her secret stayed safe. We spent the afternoon going through William's personal effects. His desk drawers contained notebooks filled with thoughts about me, business plans that included provisions for his daughter's education, and correspondence with private investigators spanning 2 decades. One letter, dated just 3 months, before his death, was addressed to me directly. My dear Luna, if you're reading this, it means I didn't live long enough to find you myself. I want you to know that not a day has passed without me thinking of you. I've wondered if you inherited my love of sailing, or if you prefer mountains to oceans like your grandmother did. I've imagined teaching you to drive, helping you with homework, walking you down the aisle someday. I hope whoever raised you loved you well, but I want you to know that your biological father loved you too, completely and unconditionally, from the moment I knew you existed. The lawyers arrived at 6 o'clock. What are you going to do about Victoria and Marcus? Carmen asked. I'm going to make sure they face consequences. They stole my inheritance and my relationship with my father. They convinced me I was worthless while sitting on money they'd taken for hiding me. Be careful, Carmen warned. People do desperate things when they're cornered. That evening, Margaret and I had dinner with Catherine to discuss strategy. The lawyer had spent the day researching similar cases and consulting with criminal law specialists. We have multiple options, Catherine explained. Civil litigation for the return of the money, criminal charges for fraud and deception, or both. The criminal charges would be more serious but harder to prove beyond reasonable doubt. What would happen to them? For the criminal charges, potentially significant jail time and substantial fines. For civil litigation, they'd be required to pay back the original amount plus interest and damages, which could total over $2 million at this point. $2 million they definitely didn't have. Marcus's job at the import company was middle management at best, and Victoria worked part-time at a nonprofit. They'd spent the money over the years, probably on Ethan's education and their comfortable lifestyle. I want them to understand the magnitude of what they've taken from me, I said. It's not just about money. They stole my father, my identity, my confidence. They made me believe I was inherently flawed. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. Your father would want justice, but he'd also want you to be happy. Don't let anger consume the life you're finally free to live. She was right, but I needed Victoria and Marcus to acknowledge what they'd done. I needed them to admit they'd lied about my worth, my potential, my very identity. Catherine suggested starting with a formal demand letter, giving them the opportunity to cooperate before pursuing criminal charges. Sometimes the threat of prosecution is enough to encourage honesty. That night, I drafted an email to my parents. I kept it simple and direct. I'm writing from San Francisco, where I've spent 2 days learning about my real father, William Harrison III. I now know about the money you took, the lies you told his investigators, and the systematic way you kept me from him while convincing me I was worthless. You have 1 week to decide whether you want to resolve this privately or through the criminal justice system. My lawyers are prepared for either option. I hesitated before hitting send. Once I sent this message, there would be no going back to the fragile relationship we'd maintained. But then I thought about William, dying while still searching for me, and I pressed send. The response came within hours. Victoria had written back. We did what we thought was best for everyone involved. You were too young to understand the complexities of the situation. We're willing to discuss this calmly when you return to Portland. Even now, faced with exposure, she couldn't admit wrongdoing. Her message implied I was still too immature to understand adult decisions, still the inadequate child she'd spent decades creating. I showed the email to Margaret and Catherine the next morning. Classic deflection, Catherine observed. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology, just an attempt to maintain control of the narrative. She's trying to manipulate you into a private conversation where she can explain away their actions, Margaret added. Your father dealt with people like this in business. They'll never admit fault unless forced to. I made my decision then. File the charges, all of them, civil and criminal. Catherine nodded approvingly. I'll draft the paperwork today. This will become public record once we file, so be prepared for media attention. The story of a stolen heiress discovering her true identity will attract reporters. The thought of publicity made me nervous, but it also felt appropriate. Victoria and Marcus had hidden me in shadows for 26 years. Maybe it was time for the truth to see daylight. That afternoon, Margaret took me shopping for clothes appropriate for a woman of my new status. I'd never owned anything that wasn't from discount stores or thrift shops, but Margaret insisted I needed professional attire for the legal proceedings ahead. Your father always said clothes weren't about impressing others, she told me as we browsed a boutique in Union Square. They're about feeling confident in your own skin. I tried on a navy blue suit that cost more than I'd made in a month at the coffee shop. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize. Not because of the expensive clothes, but because of the way I carried myself. For the first time in my life, I looked like someone who belonged in rooms where important decisions were made. "William would be so proud," Margaret said, and I could see she was fighting back tears. "He always said you'd be extraordinary once you had the chance to shine." That evening I called Ethan. He answered cautiously, probably expecting more confrontation. "Luna, are you okay? Mom and Dad are freaking out about some email you sent." "I'm fine, Ethan. Better than fine, actually. But I need you to know that everything they've told us about our family is a lie." I explained everything I'd learned, watching through the phone as my brother's world shifted the way mine had. Ethan had always been the golden child, but he'd also genuinely cared about me. Learning that our parents had built his success on money stolen from my real father devastated him. "The college fund," he said quietly. "My car, my tuition, everything they helped me with. It came from money they took to hide you? It looks that way." "Luna, I had no idea. I swear to you if I'd known any of this." "I know you didn't know. But Ethan, they're going to face legal consequences for what they've done. This is going to get public, and it's going to affect you too." He was quiet for a long moment. "What can I do to help?" The question surprised me. I'd expected him to defend our parents or try to minimize their actions. Instead, he was offering support. "Just, don't let them convince you this is all my fault. They're going to try to make me look like an ungrateful daughter who's destroying the family over money. But this isn't about money. It's about 26 years of lies." "I believe you," Ethan said firmly. "And Luna, I'm proud of you for fighting back." Catherine called the next morning with an update. "We've filed both civil and criminal charges. The prosecutor's office is very interested in the case, especially the interstate elements and the duration of the deception." "What happens now?" "Now they have to respond formally. Their lawyer will probably contact us soon to discuss plea options." I spent my last day in San Francisco walking through the city with Margaret, talking about William and the life we might have had together. She showed me his favorite restaurant, the marina where he kept his sailboat, the park where he'd proposed to her. "He used to say that love wasn't just about the time you had together," Margaret told me as we sat by the water. "It was about carrying someone in your heart even when they weren't there. He carried you every day, Luna." Flying back to Portland felt like returning to a different world. I'd left as someone's unwanted daughter and was coming back as an heiress, with lawyers and a media story that would change everything. Carmen picked me up at the airport, her eyes wide with excitement and concern. "So, what's the plan? Are you going back to your apartment? Do you need somewhere safe to stay?" I'd been thinking about that during the flight. My cramped studio felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who'd believed she deserved nothing better. But I wasn't ready for a mansion either. "I think I need somewhere in between," I said. "Somewhere I can figure out who I am now that I know the truth." Carmen drove me to a hotel in downtown Portland, a nice one with a view of the river. As we pulled up to the valet stand, I realized this was the first time in my life I could afford to stay somewhere like this without worrying about the cost. "It's going to take some getting used to," Carmen observed, watching me process the luxury around us. She was right. The money would change everything, but more importantly, the truth would change everything. I was no longer the genetically doomed failure Victoria and Marcus had created. I was William Harrison's daughter, heir to his empire and his belief in my potential. But first, I had to face the people who'd tried to bury that truth forever. The phone rang at 7 in the morning, jarring me awake in my hotel room. Catherine's voice was crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Luna, we need to meet today. Victoria and Marcus have hired an attorney, and they're claiming the original payment was a gift, not hush money. They're also alleging that you're..." mentally unstable and trying to extort them. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence, they were trying to paint me as the problem. Mentally unstable? Their lawyer filed a motion claiming you've suffered a psychological break and are making false accusations against your loving adoptive parents. They're requesting a psychiatric evaluation and suggesting your claims about William Harrison are delusional. The familiar shame washed over me before I could stop it. This was exactly what Victoria and Marcus had always done, turn my legitimate concerns into evidence of my inadequacy. But this time, I had documentation and witnesses. Can they do that? Can they actually force me to undergo psychiatric evaluation? Not without significant evidence of mental incapacity, which they don't have. But Luna, this tells us they're going to fight dirty. They're not planning to admit wrongdoing or negotiate a settlement. They're going to try to destroy your credibility. I showered and dressed in one of the suits Margaret had helped me choose, armor for the battle ahead. Looking at myself in the mirror, I practiced speaking with the confidence of someone who knew their worth. Victoria and Marcus had trained me to doubt myself, but I was learning to recognize their manipulation tactics. Catherine's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Portland high-rise. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Willamette River winding through the city where I'd spent 26 years believing I was nobody special. "Before we discuss strategy," Catherine said, spreading documents across her conference table, "I want you to understand something important. Abusers often escalate their tactics when their victims fight back. What Victoria and Marcus are doing now, attacking your mental state, claiming you're delusional, is classic behavior for people who've been caught in long-term manipulation." She handed me a folder labeled Psychological Evaluation, Luna Harrison. Inside were forms and questionnaires designed to assess my mental state. "I want you to undergo voluntary psychological evaluation by an independent psychiatrist, not because I think you need it, but because it will eliminate their ability to question your competency. We'll choose the doctor, control the process, and use the results to strengthen our case." The idea of being examined by a psychiatrist felt invasive, but I understood the strategy. What if they find something wrong with me? What if 26 years of psychological manipulation actually did damage my mental state? Catherine leaned forward, her expression gentle but firm. "Luna, surviving psychological abuse doesn't make you mentally ill. It makes you a survivor. Any competent psychiatrist will recognize the difference between trauma responses and mental incapacity." I spent the afternoon with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases involving family manipulation and financial abuse. Her office felt more like a comfortable living room than a medical facility, designed to put patients at ease. "Tell me about your childhood," Dr. Rodriguez said, settling into her chair with a notepad. "Start wherever feels comfortable." I found myself describing memories I'd buried for years. The way Victoria would praise Ethan's achievements while dismissing mine as lucky accidents. How Marcus would shake his head sadly whenever I expressed ambition, as if my dreams were symptoms of unrealistic thinking. The constant message that I should be grateful for what I had, because people like me didn't deserve more. When you say people like you, what did your parents mean by that? They said it was genetic, that I'd inherited Marcus's family tendency toward underachievement, that it was kinder to keep my expectations low than to let me experience disappointment. Dr. Rodriguez made notes without judgment. How did that messaging affect your decision-making as you got older? I thought about all the opportunities I'd passed up, the dreams I'd abandoned before even trying, community college instead of university, part-time work instead of career ambitions, always choosing the safe, small option because I'd been conditioned to believe I couldn't handle anything more challenging. I became afraid of failure because failure would prove they were right about me, so I stopped trying for things that mattered. And when you discovered the truth about your biological father, how did that change your self-perception? The question made me pause. It didn't just change how I saw myself. It changed how I understood my entire life. Everything I thought was personal weakness was actually the result of deliberate manipulation. Dr. Rodriguez conducted several standardized assessments, testing my cognitive function, emotional regulation, and reality perception. She asked detailed questions about my current mental state, my understanding of the legal situation, and my goals for the future. "Luna," she said as our session concluded, "you're one of the most psychologically resilient people I've evaluated. What your adoptive parents did was systematic emotional abuse designed to keep you dependent and compliant. The fact that you maintained your sense of self despite decades of manipulation speaks to extraordinary inner strength." Her words felt like medicine for wounds I hadn't realized were still bleeding. That evening, I met with Carmen at a restaurant near my hotel. She'd been following the case through news reports that had started appearing in local media. "The Oregonian ran a story today," she said, sliding a newspaper across the table. "Adopted daughter discovers multi-million-dollar inheritance in DNA test twist." Reading about my life in the newspaper felt surreal. The article focused on the legal drama and financial aspects, but missed the deeper story of identity theft and psychological manipulation. "How are you handling all this attention?" Carmen asked. "It's strange, but also validating. For the first time, people are paying attention to my side of the story, instead of automatically believing Victoria and Marcus." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is getting out of hand. We need to talk. Victoria." I showed the message to Carmen, who frowned. "That sounds like she's trying to regain control. Are you going to respond?" "Not directly, but I think it's time to have a public conversation about what really happened." I'd been avoiding interview requests from reporters, but Catherine had suggested that telling my story publicly might help counter Victoria and Marcus's claims about my mental state. A local television station had requested an exclusive interview, and I decided to accept. The next morning, I found myself in a television studio downtown, sitting across from journalist Rebecca Martinez. The lights were bright and the cameras intimidating, but I focused on the truth I needed to tell. "Luna, let's start with the DNA test. What made you decide to take it?" I'd always felt like an outsider in my family. My brother and I looked nothing alike, and when I asked questions about family history, my parents would change the subject or give vague answers. The test was supposed to satisfy my curiosity about ancestry. Instead, it revealed that Marcus wasn't your biological father. What was your first reaction? Shock, then confusion. But as I started researching William Harrison III, the pieces began falling into place. All those years of being told I lacked potential, that I should keep my expectations low, it made sense if my parents were hiding something about my real identity. Rebecca leaned forward. "Your adoptive parents claim the original payment from William Harrison was a gift to help with your care, and that you're now mischaracterizing their motives. How do you respond to that?" I'd prepared for this question with Catherine's help. If it was a gift to help with my care, why did they hide it from me? Why did they tell William's investigators that he was dead? Why did they discourage my education and career ambitions while using his money to fund my brother's opportunities? What do you want people to understand about your situation? This isn't about money, although the financial theft is serious. This is about identity. For 26 years, I believed I was genetically programmed for mediocrity. I passed up opportunities, abandoned dreams, and settled for less because I'd been conditioned to think I didn't deserve better. My real father spent decades searching for me, believing in my potential, building a legacy he wanted to share with me. Victoria and Marcus stole that from both of us. The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate. My hotel phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, legal advocates, and people sharing similar stories of family manipulation. Social media buzzed with discussion about parental psychological abuse and the long-term effects of being told, "You're worthless." Catherine called after watching the broadcast. "Perfect. You came across as credible, intelligent, and emotionally stable. Their claims about your mental state look ridiculous now." But Victoria and Marcus weren't finished fighting. The next morning brought news that they'd filed a counter-lawsuit, claiming I was defaming them and damaging Marcus's career. They demanded a public retraction of my false accusations and monetary damages for emotional distress. "They're desperate," Catherine explained during our emergency meeting. "This countersuit has no legal merit, but it's designed to intimidate you and drain our resources. They're hoping you'll settle to make the negative publicity go away." I thought about the woman I'd been just 2 weeks ago, afraid to order expensive coffee because I couldn't afford it. That version of me might have been intimidated by legal threats and public confrontation. But I wasn't that person anymore. "Let them try," I said. "I have better lawyers and better evidence. Most importantly, I have the truth." The media attention intensified over the following days. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about DNA testing and family secrets. Television talk shows debated the ethics of taking money to hide a child from their biological parent. Legal experts analyzed the criminal charges on cable news programs. Dr. Rodriguez's psychiatric evaluation report arrived on Thursday, providing exactly the ammunition we needed. Her assessment concluded that I showed no signs of mental illness, delusions, or impaired judgment. Instead, she documented clear evidence of having survived long-term psychological manipulation and noted my remarkable resilience and clarity in processing traumatic revelations. The subject demonstrates exceptional psychological health given the circumstances of systematic emotional abuse, the report stated. Her current actions and decisions show appropriate judgment and realistic assessment of her situation. Catherine filed the report with the court along with a motion to dismiss Victoria and Marcus's claims about my mental competency. She also requested sanctions against their attorney for filing frivolous motions designed to harass a victim of fraud. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation was advancing rapidly. Portland police had interviewed several people who remembered Victoria's contradictory stories about my paternity over the years. Ethan provided a statement describing how our parents had funded his education while claiming they couldn't afford mine. Even Mrs. Patterson, the family friend who'd always seemed loyal to Victoria, admitted she'd always wondered why I looked nothing like my supposed father. The breakthrough came when investigators located the notary who'd witnessed Victoria's fake documents 20 years ago. Patricia Williams still worked at the same office, and she remembered the transaction clearly because Victoria had seemed nervous and had paid cash for the notarization. She brought documents claiming her daughter had died in an accident, Patricia told investigators, but she kept changing details about when and where it happened. I almost refused to notarize because something felt wrong, but she was so insistent, and the paperwork looked official. With Patricia's testimony, we had proof that Victoria had actively created false documents to deceive Williams' investigators. The criminal case went from strong to ironclad. I was reviewing financial documents in Catherine's office when her assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see Luna. Says he's her brother." Ethan looked exhausted when he entered the conference room. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, and his eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Luna, we need to talk. This whole situation is destroying our family." "No," I corrected him gently. "Victoria and Marcus destroyed our family 26 years ago when they decided to build it on lies and stolen money. This situation is just revealing the truth." He slumped into a chair across from me. "Mom won't stop crying. Dad's not talking to anyone. Their lawyer says they could go to prison." They could. What they did was criminal, Ethan. They took money to hide me from my father, then spent decades convincing me I was worthless while using his money to give you opportunities. I know. His voice was barely audible. I've been thinking about all the times they told you that you couldn't handle college, that you should keep your expectations low. Meanwhile, they were paying for my tuition with money that should have been yours. Ethan pulled out his phone and showed me his banking app. I've been calculating how much they spent on me over the years. Tuition, books, my car, living expenses. It's over $200,000. Ethan, you didn't know. But I should have questioned it. I should have wondered why they could afford to help me, but not you. I was so focused on my own success that I ignored how differently they treated us. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. I want to testify against them. The statement shocked me. You want to what? I want to tell the court what I witnessed, how they discouraged your dreams while encouraging mine. How they acted like your lack of success was inevitable while treating my achievements like proof of superior genetics. I want to help you get justice. Catherine had been listening quietly from her desk. Ethan, that's a significant decision. Testifying against your parents could have lasting consequences for your relationship with them. They made their choice when they decided to steal Luna's inheritance and convince her she was worthless. I'm making mine now. That evening, I sat in my hotel room thinking about forgiveness and justice. Margaret had called earlier, encouraging me to remember that William would want me to be happy rather than consumed by anger. But this wasn't about anger anymore. It was about ensuring that Victoria and Marcus faced consequences for their actions and couldn't manipulate anyone else the way they'd manipulated me. I drafted a statement for the media, knowing it would likely be my last public comment before the legal proceedings concluded. Some people have asked why I'm pursuing legal action against the people who raised me instead of simply moving forward with my life. The answer is simple. Accountability matters. For 26 years, Victoria and Marcus convinced me that I was genetically inferior, that my dreams were unrealistic, that I should be grateful for scraps because people like me didn't deserve banquets. They did this while sitting on money. They'd taken to hide me from a father who believed I deserved the world. This case isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that parents can't steal their children's identities, hide their heritage, and psychologically abuse them without facing consequences. It's about honoring the memory of William Harrison III, who died believing he'd failed his daughter when the truth is that others prevented him from reaching her. Most importantly, it's about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I am not the worthless failure Victoria and Marcus created. I am William Harrison's daughter, heir to his legacy and his belief in my potential. It took a DNA test to prove my worth in dollars, but my value as a human being was never in question. The statement ran in newspapers across the country the next day. It generated thousands of supportive messages from people who'd experienced similar family manipulation and psychological abuse. Many shared their own stories of parents who'd undermined their confidence while hiding important information about their identity or heritage. Dr. Rodriguez called after reading the statement. Luna, what you've written captures something important about psychological abuse in families. Would you consider speaking at conferences about your experience? There are therapists and social workers who could learn from your story. The idea intrigued me. Maybe my painful experience could help others recognize and escape similar manipulation. Maybe William's belief in using success to help others could guide how I used my platform. But first, I needed to see justice served for the people who'd tried to bury my potential forever. Catherine scheduled our final preparation meeting for the following week. The criminal trial was set to begin in 30 days, and the civil lawsuit would follow immediately after. Media attention had reached a fever pitch, with legal commentators predicting the case would set precedents for prosecuting long-term family fraud. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the woman I'd been just 3 weeks ago. She'd believed she was worthless. genetically doomed, deserving of nothing better than survival. Now I knew the truth. I was valuable, loved, and capable of extraordinary things. It had taken $47 million and a courtroom battle to prove it, but sometimes the most important victories require fighting for them. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras when I arrived on the morning of the criminal trial. I wore the charcoal gray suit Margaret had insisted I buy in San Francisco, my hair pulled back in a professional style that made me look older, more serious. Catherine walked beside me, carrying briefcases filled with evidence that would finally expose 26 years of deception. "Remember," she said quietly as we approached the courthouse entrance, "stay calm no matter what their attorney says. They're going to try to provoke an emotional reaction that makes you look unstable." The courtroom was larger than I'd expected, with oak-paneled walls and high ceilings that made everyone's voice echo. Victoria and Marcus sat at the defendant's table with their lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Ronald Kirk, who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Victoria wore a conservative black dress and pearls, the picture of respectability. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, refusing to look in my direction. Judge Patricia Holloway called the court to order with a stern voice that commanded immediate attention. She was known for running efficient trials and having little patience for dramatic theatrics from either side. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michael Chen, opened with a methodical presentation of the charges. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the systematic theft of a child's identity and inheritance through fraud, deception, and psychological manipulation spanning nearly 3 decades. He outlined the evidence piece by piece. The original payment of $500,000, the signed agreement Victoria had violated, the false death certificate she'd created, the lies told to investigators over 20 years. Each revelation, built on the previous one, creating an undeniable pattern of criminal behavior. The defendants didn't just steal money," Chen continued. "They stole Luna Harrison's relationship with her biological father, her sense of self-worth, and her rightful inheritance. They convinced a brilliant young woman that she was genetically programmed for failure while building their son's future, on money meant for her." Ronald Kirk's opening statement attempted to reframe the narrative entirely. "My clients are loving parents who made difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. Victoria was a young, frightened woman when she became pregnant. William Harrison was a powerful businessman who wanted to avoid scandal. The payment wasn't extortion. It was support for a child he never intended to acknowledge." Kirk painted Victoria as a victim of her circumstances and me as an opportunistic adult seeking to profit from a generous man's death. Luna Harrison has created a fantasy about the father she never knew, ignoring the reality that he paid her mother to disappear because he didn't want the complications of an unplanned child. I gripped the edge of my seat, fighting the familiar shame that Kirk's words triggered. This was exactly what Victoria and Marcus had always done: twist the narrative to make me the problem, the ungrateful child who didn't appreciate their sacrifices. The first witness was Margaret, who testified about William's decades-long search for me. She described his anguish over my disappearance, the investigators he'd hired, the foundation he'd started in hopes I might see it and contact him. "William never stopped believing he would find his daughter," Margaret said, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "He kept a room ready for her, bought presents every birthday and Christmas, wrote letters he hoped to give her someday. The idea that he didn't want Luna in his life is absolutely false." Kirk's cross-examination was brutal. "Mrs. Harrison, isn't it true that your husband could have fought for custody if he'd really wanted his daughter? Isn't it possible he preferred the arrangement where he paid support, but had no parental responsibilities?" Margaret's response was fierce. "My husband spent millions of dollars and 26 years searching for Luna. He blamed himself every day for not fighting harder when she first disappeared. The suggestion that he preferred her absence is not just wrong, it's cruel." The next witness was Patricia Williams, the notary who'd processed Victoria's false documents. She described Victoria's nervous behavior and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the fake death certificate. The defendant seemed agitated and kept changing her story about when and where the alleged accident had occurred, Patricia testified. I almost refused to notarize the documents because something felt wrong, but she was insistent and offered to pay additional fees for rush processing. Victoria's face remained impassive during Patricia's testimony, but I noticed her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. Ethan took the stand on the second day, and the courtroom was completely silent as he was sworn in. He looked directly at our parents as he raised his right hand, his expression resolved but pained. "Mr. Caldwell," Chen began, "please describe the differences in how your parents treated you and your sister growing up." Ethan's voice was steady but quiet. "They always told me I was smart, capable, destined for success. They encouraged my ambitions and helped fund my education. With Luna, it was the opposite. They constantly told her she wasn't smart enough for college, that she should keep her expectations low, that people in our family didn't have the genetics for professional success." "Did you ever question these differences?" "I should have, but I didn't. I was benefiting from their support, so I didn't think critically about why Luna wasn't receiving the same encouragement." Chen presented financial records showing how Victoria and Marcus had spent over $200,000 on Ethan's education, while claiming they couldn't afford my community college tuition. "Looking at these expenses now, Mr. Caldwell, do you believe your parents had the financials means to support your sister's education?" "Yes, they definitely had the money. They chose not to spend it on Luna while telling her it was because she wasn't college material." Kirk's cross-examination focused on Ethan's loyalty to family. "Mr. Caldwell, doesn't it strike you as disloyal to testify against the parents who raised and supported you?" Ethan's answer surprised everyone, including me. "What strikes me as disloyal is allowing them to get away with psychologically abusing my sister for 26 years. My parents stole Luna's inheritance and convinced her she was worthless. Loyalty to family means protecting family members from abuse, even when the abusers are your parents." The third day brought testimony from Dr. Rodriguez, who explained the psychological impact of long-term manipulation and gaslighting. She described how Victoria and Marcus had systematically undermined my confidence while hiding information that would have revealed their deception. The defendants created what we call learned helplessness, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the jury. They convinced Luna that failure was inevitable due to her genetics, which prevented her from pursuing opportunities that might have led to discovering the truth about her identity. Kirk tried to discredit the psychological evaluation. "Dr. Rodriguez, isn't it possible that Luna Harrison has convinced herself of this narrative to justify pursuing legal action for financial gain?" "No. The psychological patterns I documented are consistent with long-term emotional abuse, not fabricated memories or delusional thinking. Ms. Harrison shows remarkable psychological health given what she's endured." The most damaging testimony came from investigators who'd interviewed Victoria 20 years earlier. Detective James Morrison, now retired, testified about the false leads Victoria had provided when William's private investigators located her. "The defendant told us that William Harrison had died in a car accident and that the child had been adopted by a family in another state," Morrison testified. She provided what appeared to be official documentation supporting her claims. We later discovered all of it was fabricated. Chen played recordings of those interviews, letting the jury hear Victoria's lies in her own voice. The confidence with which she'd lied was chilling. Smooth, detailed fabrications designed to send investigators in the wrong direction. "Did Miss Caldwell seem distressed about discussing her deceased former partner?" Chen asked. "Not at all. She seemed relieved that we'd be closing the case and moving on." On the fourth day, Victoria took the stand in her own defense. Kirk had apparently decided that her testimony was necessary to counter the overwhelming evidence of deception. "Ms. Caldwell, please tell the jury why you accepted money from William Harrison." Victoria's voice was soft, calculated to evoke sympathy. "I was 22 years old, pregnant, and terrified. William was a powerful man with resources I couldn't imagine. When he offered financial help, I saw it as a chance to give my daughter a stable life." "Why didn't you maintain contact with Mr. Harrison?" "He made it clear that he didn't want ongoing involvement. The payment was supposed to be final, support for the child with no further obligations on either side." Kirk led Victoria through a carefully crafted narrative that portrayed her as a young woman who'd done her best in difficult circumstances. According to her version, William had wanted to avoid scandal and preferred the arrangement where he provided financial support, but no public acknowledgement. But Chen's cross-examination dismantled her story piece by piece. "Ms. Caldwell, if the original agreement was final with no further obligations, why did you create false documents claiming Mr. Harrison was dead?" Victoria hesitated. "I thought it would be easier for everyone if the past stayed in the past." "Easier for whom? Easier for you to keep money you'd obtained under false pretenses?" "That's not what happened." Chen presented the recording of Victoria's conversation with investigators. "This is your voice, isn't it, Ms. Caldwell, telling trained investigators that William Harrison died in a car accident?" "I was trying to protect my family. By lying to prevent a father from finding his missing daughter? I thought Luna was better off with us. Better off believing she was genetically inferior? Better off having her college dreams discouraged? While you spent her inheritance on your son's education?" Victoria's composure finally cracked. "We gave her a good life. We raised her, fed her, kept her safe. While convincing her she was worthless and hiding millions of dollars that belonged to her, she wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility." The admission hung in the air like poison. Victoria had essentially confessed that she'd known about my inheritance all along and had appointed herself the judge of whether I deserved it. Marcus's testimony was brief and devastating to their defense. He mumbled his way through Kirk's questions, admitting that he'd known the original payment came from my biological father, but claiming he'd believed Victoria's explanations about why contact wasn't maintained. Chen's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Caldwell, did you believe it was appropriate to use money intended for Luna's support to fund your son's education while telling Luna she wasn't college material?" "We thought we were making good decisions for both children. By giving one child every advantage while convincing the other she was genetically programmed for failure." Marcus had no answer. The closing arguments crystallized the central issues of the case. Chen summarized the evidence methodically, showing how each element proved deliberate fraud and ongoing deception. Victoria and Marcus Caldwell didn't just steal money, Chen concluded. They stole a young woman's identity, her relationship with her father, and her belief in her own worth. They convinced Luna Harrison that she was inherently inferior while building their son's future on her stolen inheritance. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated, decades-long conspiracy to defraud both Luna and her biological father. Kirk's closing argument attempted to evoke sympathy for Victoria and Marcus as ordinary people who'd made imperfect decisions in extraordinary circumstances. "My clients aren't criminals," Kirk argued. "They're parents who did their best to raise a child they believed had been abandoned. Yes, they made mistakes. Yes, they should have handled things differently. But criminal intent requires deliberate malice, not human error in judgment." Judge Holloway's instructions to the jury were clear and thorough. She explained the legal definitions of fraud, conspiracy, and theft, emphasizing that good intentions couldn't excuse criminal behavior when the evidence showed deliberate deception. The jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. I spent that time in Catherine's office, trying to focus on planning my future rather than obsessing over the trial outcome. Margaret had flown up from San Francisco and sat with me, sharing stories. about William that helped me understand the father I'd never known. "Whatever the jury decides," Margaret said, "you've already won the most important victory. You know who you are now. You know you're loved and valued. No verdict can take that away." But I needed the legal validation. I needed 12 strangers to confirm that what Victoria and Marcus had done was wrong, that my years of feeling worthless had been the result of their lies, not my inherent inadequacy. The call came at 4:30 on Thursday afternoon. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed when we returned. Victoria and Marcus sat rigidly at the defendant's table, while I took my place in the front row behind the prosecution. My hands were shaking, but my resolve was solid. Judge Holloway asked the foreperson to read the verdict. The woman stood, holding a piece of paper that would determine whether justice would be served. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendants guilty." Victoria made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "On the charge of theft, by deception, we find the defendants guilty." Marcus slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his comfortable life was over. "On the charge of conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendants guilty." I closed my eyes and felt 26 years of shame and self-doubt finally lifting from my shoulders. 12 strangers had examined the evidence and concluded that I wasn't the problem, wasn't the ungrateful daughter or the delusional young woman seeking easy money. I was the victim of a calculated, long-term crime. Judge Holloway scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she addressed Victoria and Marcus immediately after the verdict. The court finds that this was a sophisticated, long-term conspiracy that caused immeasurable harm to multiple victims. The defendants showed no remorse and continued their deception even during trial proceedings. This court will consider the maximum allowable sentences. Outside the courthouse, Catherine fielded questions from reporters while I stood quietly beside her. The vindication felt surreal after years of being told I was oversensitive, ungrateful, and prone to making mountains out of molehills. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter called out. I stepped forward to the microphones. "I feel validated. For 26 years, I believed I was the problem in my family. I thought my lack of success was evidence of genetic inferiority, that my dreams were unrealistic, that I should be grateful for scraps, because that's all people like me deserved." Today, 12 jurors confirmed that the problem was never me. The problem was the people who stole my identity and convinced me I was worthless. That evening, Margaret, Catherine, Ethan, and I had dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuinely peaceful. "What happens next?" Ethan asked. He'd been subdued since the verdict, processing the reality that our parents would likely spend years in prison. "The civil trial starts next month," Catherine explained. "We'll pursue recovery of the original payment plus interest and damages. Given today's verdict, I expect Victoria and Marcus will want to settle rather than face another public trial. And after that?" I looked out at the river, thinking about the future I was finally free to create. "After that, I figure out how to honor my father's memory by using his legacy to help other people." William Harrison III had died believing he'd failed his daughter. But his real failure hadn't been losing me. It had been the people who'd stolen me from him. Now I had the chance to carry forward his belief in potential, his commitment to giving people opportunities to succeed. The legal victory was important, but it was just the beginning. The real work would be learning to live as someone who knew her worth, someone who understood that her dreams were valid and her potential unlimited. For the first time in my life, I was excited to discover what I was capable of achieving. 6 months after the criminal trial, I stood in the lobby of what had once been a failing community center in southeast Portland. Sunlight streamed through, windows that had been boarded up for years, illuminating walls freshly painted in warm, welcoming colors. The space hummed with activity as contractors put finishing touches on what would become the William Harrison Center for Creative Potential. The civil lawsuit had concluded 3 weeks earlier, with Victoria and Marcus agreeing to pay restitution of $3.7 million. They'd mortgaged their house, liquidated their retirement accounts, and would be making payments for the rest of their lives. More importantly, they'd been forced to publicly acknowledge their fraud in a formal apology that was entered into court records. But money had never been the real victory. The vindication had come from watching Victoria's carefully constructed facade crumble as she was forced to admit she'd known about my inheritance all along. She'd stood in a courtroom and confessed that she'd deliberately undermined my confidence because she'd decided I wasn't ready for responsibility, wasn't worthy of my own legacy. Their sentencing had been swift and severe. Victoria received 4 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. Marcus got 3 years for his role in the deception. Judge Holloway had been particularly harsh about their lack of remorse, noting that they'd continued lying even after being caught. The defendants showed more concern for their own reputations than for the victim they'd psychologically tormented for decades, she'd said, before handing down their sentences. Their actions weren't just criminal, they were cruel in a way that defies understanding. I hadn't attended their sentencing. By then, I was focused entirely on the future rather than the past. Catherine had represented me while I spent the day in San Francisco, working with architects on plans for the center. The idea had come to me during my first week back in Portland after the trial. I'd been walking through my old neighborhood, looking at the coffee shop where I'd worked for minimum wage while believing I was lucky to have any job at all. The contrast between who I'd been and who I was becoming felt stark and tragic. How many other young people were walking around believing they were worthless because someone had convinced them they lacked potential? Margaret had been enthusiastic about the center concept from the beginning. William always said the best way to honor someone's memory was to help others discover their own strength, she'd told me. He would love knowing his legacy was being used this way. The center would offer creative arts programs, career counseling, and psychological support for young adults who'd experienced family manipulation or educational neglect. We'd partnered with local colleges to provide pathway programs for people who'd been told they weren't college material. Most importantly, we'd created a safe space for people to discover their potential without judgment or artificial limitations. Dr. Rodriguez had agreed to oversee our counseling programs, bringing her expertise in family trauma and psychological recovery. What you're creating here will help people rebuild their sense of self-worth, she'd told me during our planning meetings. That's some of the most important work anyone can do. The center would officially open in 2 weeks, but today was our first community event. Local artists were setting up displays in what would become our main gallery space. The pottery studio was ready for its first classes. Our small recording studio was equipped for music therapy sessions. Carmen found me in the main hall, reviewing the schedule for opening week. She'd left her job at the bank to become the center's program coordinator, excited about the chance to help other people discover opportunities they'd never imagined possible. The registration numbers are incredible, she said, showing me her tablet. We have a waiting list for almost every program. People are hungry for this kind of support. Looking at those numbers, I thought about all the years I'd spent believing I was the only one struggling with feelings of inadequacy. The response to our outreach efforts had revealed how many people carried similar wounds, how many had been told they weren't smart enough, creative enough, or worthy enough to pursue their dreams. Ethan appeared in the doorway, carrying coffee. For all of us, he'd graduated college and moved to Portland, taking a job with a nonprofit that provided financial literacy education. Our relationship had been healing slowly, built on honest conversations about our childhood and his commitment to understanding how privilege and manipulation had shaped our family dynamic. The sound system is working perfectly, he reported. Your opening speech is going to sound great. The thought of public speaking still made me nervous, but it was a different kind of nervousness than I'd experienced before discovering my identity. Now, I was nervous about doing justice to the opportunity, not about proving I deserved to have a voice. Margaret arrived an hour before the event began, carrying a large wrapped package. At 72, she moved with the energy of someone half her age, particularly when she was excited about a project. "This is from William's office," she said, setting the package on a table. "I've been saving it for today." Inside was a bronze plaque bearing William's photograph and a quote I'd never seen before. "Every person carries seeds of greatness, but not everyone gets the soil, water, and sunlight they need to grow. Our job is to provide the conditions for flourishing." "He wrote that for a speech about the Harrison Foundation," Margaret explained. "I think he'd want it here, in the place where his daughter is creating exactly those conditions." People began arriving for the opening celebration at 4 o'clock. Some came because they'd followed the news coverage of my story. Others were community members curious about the new programs we'd be offering. Many were young adults who'd heard about our mission and hoped we might help them overcome barriers that had kept them from pursuing their goals. I recognized several faces from the coffee shop where I'd worked, people who'd known me as the quiet girl who seemed grateful for scraps. Their expressions ranged from amazement to something that looked like hope. If someone they'd known as a failure could transform her life this dramatically, maybe transformation was possible for them too. The opening ceremony began with remarks from city council members and community leaders who'd supported the center's development. Then Dr. Rodriguez spoke about the psychological impact of creative expression and supportive community. Finally, it was my turn to address the crowd. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces filled with curiosity and possibility, I felt the weight of responsibility and opportunity in equal measure. These people had come because they'd heard about second chances, about discovering potential they'd been told didn't exist. 9 months ago, I believed I was genetically programmed for mediocrity, I began. I'd been convinced that dreams were dangerous, that people like me should keep our expectations low to avoid disappointment. I worked minimum wage jobs and lived in a studio apartment, grateful for scraps because I'd been taught that scraps were all I deserved. I paused, looking directly at individuals in the audience. But the problem was never my genetics. The problem was that people I trusted had stolen my identity and convinced me I was worthless while hiding the truth about who I really was. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some had followed my story in the media, but hearing it directly was different. A DNA test changed everything, not because it revealed I was worth millions of dollars, but because it proved that everything I'd been told about my limitations was a lie. I am William Harrison's daughter, heir to his belief in human potential, and his commitment to creating opportunities for others. I gestured to the space around us, to the art studios and counseling rooms and learning spaces we'd created. This center exists because I learned that worth isn't something you inherit in your bank account. It's something you discover when someone believes in your potential and gives you the tools to develop it. Every person here carries seeds of greatness. Our job is to provide the soil, water, and sunlight you need to grow. The applause was warm and sustained, but more importantly, I could see recognition in people's faces. They understood that this wasn't just my story. It was a template for anyone who'd been told they weren't enough. After the ceremony, people toured the facility and signed up for programs. I spent the evening talking with individuals who shared their own stories of being discouraged, dismissed, or convinced they lacked ability. A young woman named Sarah told me she'd been told she wasn't smart enough for nursing school. A man named David said his family had convinced him he lacked the discipline for entrepreneurship. A teenager named Alex explained that her guidance counselor had suggested she lower her expectations about college. Each conversation reinforced my conviction that the center was addressing a real need. People weren't just hungry for opportunity. They were desperate for someone to believe in their potential after years of being told they were aiming too high. Carmen found me near closing time, exhausted but exhilarated by the response we'd received. 63 people signed up for programs tonight, she reported, and I collected 47 stories about people being told they weren't capable of achieving their dreams. Those numbers represented more than enrollment statistics. They represented 47 opportunities to help someone discover their worth, 63 chances to provide the support and encouragement that could change a life's trajectory. Margaret stayed late to help with cleanup, moving around the center like she was exploring her new favorite place. "William would be so proud," she said as we locked up the building. "Not just because you've honored his memory, but because you've taken everything painful from your experience and transformed it into something healing for others." Driving home to my new apartment overlooking the river, I reflected on the strange mathematics of transformation. 9 months ago, I'd been worth minimum wage plus tips. Tonight, I was worth $47 million, and the knowledge that I could create opportunities for others to discover their potential. But the real change wasn't financial. It was psychological, spiritual, fundamental. I no longer approached life from a position of scarcity and self-doubt. I made decisions from abundance and confidence, not because money had changed my personality, but because truth had changed my understanding of who I was. The next few weeks flew by as the center hit its stride. Our art therapy sessions filled immediately. The college preparation program attracted dozens of adults who'd been told they weren't academic material. Our career counseling services helped people recognize skills and interests they'd been taught to dismiss as impractical. One morning, while reviewing program evaluations, I found a note from Sarah, the woman who'd been told she wasn't smart enough for nursing school. She'd enrolled in our college prep program and scored high enough on placement tests to enter the pre-nursing track at Portland Community College. "For the first time in my life," she'd written, "someone helped me see my potential instead of my limitations. I start classes next month, and I know I'm going to succeed." Reading her note, I thought about the ripple effect of belief. William had believed in my potential despite never meeting me. Margaret had nurtured that belief and helped me claim it. Now I was passing it forward to people who'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to see their worth. Dr. Rodriguez had been tracking outcomes from our programs and was amazed by the results. "People are making dramatic life changes after just a few weeks of support," she told me during one of our monthly reviews. "It's confirmation that most barriers to success are psychological rather than practical." The center's success attracted attention from foundations and educational institutions across the country. We received requests to consult on similar programs in other cities. Several universities wanted to partner with us on research about overcoming educational trauma. But the validation that meant the most came from unexpected sources. One afternoon, while I was reviewing applications for our expanded programs, the receptionist announced I had a visitor who wouldn't give her name. Mrs. Patterson stood in my office doorway, looking older and smaller than I remembered. She'd been Victoria's closest friend, someone who'd always treated me like an unfortunate burden the family had to bear. "Luna," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I gestured to a chair, curious about what had brought her here. "I knew," she said without preamble. "Not about the money or the legal details, but I knew Victoria was lying about something. The way she talked about you, the way she discouraged your ambitions while bragging about Ethan's achievements. It never felt right." Mrs. Patterson twisted her hands in her lap, clearly uncomfortable but determined to continue. "I should have said something. I should have questioned why a smart, creative girl like you was being told she wasn't capable of success. I was complicit in your psychological abuse because I chose not to see what was happening." Her words carried the weight of genuine remorse. "When I read about what you've created here, about how you're helping other people overcome the same kind of manipulation you experienced, it made me realize how much potential I helped suppress." I considered her apology carefully. Mrs. Patterson represented all the adults who'd witnessed my treatment and chosen not to intervene, who'd accepted Victoria's narrative about my limitations because questioning it would have been uncomfortable. "Thank you for acknowledging that," I said finally. "It takes courage to admit you were complicit in someone's harm." She reached into her purse and pulled out a check. "I'd like to make a donation to the center. It won't undo the damage, but Maybe it can help prevent someone else from experiencing what you went through. The check was for $10,000, more money than Mrs. Patterson had ever spent on anything frivolous. "I have one request," she added. "I'd like to volunteer. Here. I want to help identify young people who are being told they're not capable, who are having their potential systematically undermined by people who should be supporting them." Her offer surprised me, but it also made sense. Who better to recognize the signs of psychological manipulation than someone who'd witnessed it firsthand and failed to act? "We can use that kind of advocacy," I agreed. "Many of our participants have family members who don't support their goals. Having someone who understands those dynamics could be invaluable." Mrs. Patterson became one of our most effective volunteers, using her experience as a retired teacher to identify students whose confidence had been systematically undermined. She developed a program specifically for family advocacy, teaching relatives how to support rather than discourage their loved one's ambitions. The center's first anniversary celebration drew over 300 people, including participants who'd completed programs and moved on to college, new careers, or creative pursuits they'd never thought possible. We displayed before and after stories that demonstrated the transformative power of believing in human potential. Margaret flew up from San Francisco for the celebration, bringing news that the Harrison Maritime Solutions Board had voted to establish an endowment for the center. "William's business partners were so impressed by what you've created that they want to ensure it continues in perpetuity," she told me. "The endowment will generate enough annual income to fund operations and expansion." Financial sustainability meant we could focus entirely on our mission rather than fundraising. More importantly, it meant William's legacy would continue helping people discover their potential for generations to come. During the anniversary celebration, I was introduced to a woman named Jennifer, whose story reminded me powerfully of my own journey. She'd grown up being told she lacked the intelligence for professional careers, had worked service jobs while believing she should be grateful for any employment. After participating in our programs, she'd discovered a gift for financial analysis and was starting an accounting degree at Portland State University. "I spent 34 years believing I was too stupid for anything beyond retail work," Jennifer told the crowd during our success story presentations. This center didn't just help me discover my abilities, it helped me understand that I'd been systematically convinced I was worthless by people who should have been building my confidence. Her words captured something essential about our mission. We weren't just providing education or career training. We were helping people recognize and overcome psychological manipulation that had convinced them they were inherently limited. Standing on the stage that night, looking out at faces filled with hope and determination, I felt the presence of everyone who'd shaped this moment. William, who'd believed in my potential despite never meeting me. Margaret, who'd nurtured his legacy and helped me claim my identity. Catherine, who'd fought for justice and accountability. Ethan, who'd chosen truth over family loyalty. Even Victoria and Marcus, whose crimes had inadvertently led to this opportunity to help others. But mostly, I felt the presence of my own transformation. The frightened, convinced she was worthless woman who'd taken a DNA test 9 months ago had become someone who knew her value and used her resources to help others discover theirs. William Harrison III spent 26 years searching for his daughter, I told the celebrating crowd. He died believing he'd failed to find me. But his real legacy isn't the money he left behind. It's the proof that love and belief in potential can survive any obstacle, including time and distance and deliberate deception. I gestured to the center around us, to the programs and people and possibilities we'd created together. This is what happens when someone believes you're capable of greatness. This is what's possible when you refuse to accept that your dreams are too big or your background too limited. This is the inheritance William Harrison really left me. Not $47 million, but the knowledge that every person carries seeds of extraordinary potential. The applause was thunderous, but more meaningful was the look of recognition in people's faces. They understood that this story belonged to all of us, that transformation was possible for anyone willing to question the limitations others had placed on them. Later that night, after the last guests had left and the cleaning was finished, I stood alone in the center's main hall. The bronze plaque with William's photograph caught the light from the street lamps outside, his words about providing conditions for flourishing seeming to glow in the darkness. I thought about the girl who'd believed she was genetically programmed for failure, who'd worked for tips and lived in a studio apartment while being grateful for scraps. She'd taken a DNA test hoping to learn about her ancestry and instead discovered she was worth millions. But the real discovery hadn't been about money. It had been about identity, potential, and the transformative power of truth. I wasn't valuable because I'd inherited $47 million. I'd inherited $47 million because I was valuable, because my father had recognized my worth even when others tried to hide it. Now I knew who I was. William Harrison's daughter, heir to his belief in human potential, creator of opportunities for others to discover their own greatness. The DNA test had proved I was worth millions, but more importantly, it had proved that worth isn't something you earn or inherit. It's something you recognize and claim and use to lift others up. Standing in that quiet hall, surrounded by evidence of dreams becoming reality, I finally understood the most important truth of all. We're all worth more than we've been told, and discovering that worth is the beginning of everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.